Hello and welcome to the Take 15 podcast from CFA Institute. I'm Lauren Foster, and this is the show where we bring you an unbiased lens on investing and capital markets through short conversations with some of the world's most interesting and accomplished people. This week, I have a very special guest joining me in the studio, my good friend, columnist and author Paul Sullivan. Paul writes the weekly Wealth Matters column for the New York Times and the Money Game column for Golf magazine. He's also the author of The Thin Green Line, The Money Secrets of the Super Wealthy, and Clutch, Why Some People Excel Under Pressure and Others Don't. Paul and I have known each other for more than 20 years. We first met at the Financial Times back in 2000. His first big story for the FT was a profile of the author Kurt Vonnegut, based on a train ride they took from Springfield, Massachusetts to New York City. His last piece for the FT was Vonnegut's obituary. As you'll hear, Paul is a passionate golfer and raconteur. We talk about what he learned about managing money after writing 575 columns, why we all have money scripts, and why it's important to know what that script is, and his experiences interviewing the likes of Tiger Woods, Greg Norman, and Richard Thaler. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed talking to Paul. Paul Sullivan, welcome to the show.
Lauren Foster, thanks for having me on.
Well, as the listeners heard in the setup, we go way back since our days back in the Financial Times. So I thought a fun place for us to start would be where our paths diverge. So I stayed at the FT. You went on to the New York Times. It was back in 2008. You launched a column, Wealth Matters. That was pretty much when Lehman had collapsed. Bernie Madoff just got arrested. What was it like to launch a Wealth Matters column in the financial crisis? And what were you trying to do with your column?
Look, Lauren, we've known each other 21 years. You know I've always had impeccable timing. So I tell the story that I interviewed at the New York Times the day Bear Stearns collapsed. I was told I would get to write the column the day Lehman Brothers collapsed. And my first column ran right around when Bernie Madoff was escorted out of his Park Avenue apartment. So again, perfect timing, really great way to start a wealth column, but it changed a lot. We're coming out of, the idea was conceived coming out of 2007, where everything was still, quite frothy. And, when you and I were at the FT together, I had created a similar wealth column there, but that was a, very different time, very different paper. And so we pivoted pretty quickly with my Wealth Matters column at the Times. And from the beginning, the one thing I wanted to do was to see if I could take, the actions and the decisions made by some of the wealthiest people in America and apply them to people with far less resources. These were, the sort of middle class and upper middle class readers of the New York Times. And whenever I could do that, I considered the column successful.
So I guess more than a decade has passed since that first column. And I think it was in 2019 that you reached your 500th column. Is that right?
Yeah, I started it with a lot more hair. So, as of our discussion today, I just wrote the 575th column. So it's been a lot of fun. And, for that 500th column, one of the things I did was I essentially went back and skimmed the 499 columns before. And I'll say, like, the thing that I was proudest of is as I kept going with that idea of taking these lessons from the super rich and applying them to, people of more modest means. And I also didn't repeat myself too much. So I was proud of that.
That's a good thing. So a lot of financial advisors listen to the podcast. What were some of the main lessons that you gleaned over 500 columns of talking to lots of different people, lots of different advisors?
I guess, when I broke them down, maybe I was surprised, maybe I wasn't, but roughly, a 20% to, a quarter of the columns had something to do with taxes. And these weren't all just, taxes for the wealthiest, though I did write an awful lot about estate and gift taxes. It was, how everybody should think through their tax planning. And those are always the columns, they're often the most difficult columns to write, because if you make one mistake on a tax column, you're guaranteed to get 100 emails pointing that mistake out. But they're also the ones that often had the best response from people at all different levels, because people were were curious. They wanted to know, how do they go about doing their own tax planning. And I guess by the second one, uh, if you think of like a broad group, the second one was really anything to do with how we think about money, whether it be, how we decide whether to splurge on something or, more practically, how do we talk to our children about money? Not, in some cases, it's money they might one day inherit. In other cases, it was, how do they make good financial decisions with whatever money, they earn? Those are probably the two broad categories that stuck out the most.
So actually, in a few minutes, I want to go more into the sort of talking to kids about money. But before I do, I'd love to know, like, do you have a favorite column that you wrote?
There are some that stuck out as like, completely bonkers out there. And one of those was this whole group of people who created their own bespoke perfume. So they sort of work with perfumers to create a scent that only they would have. And as you might imagine, this is a wildly expensive thing to do. And I don't remember the quote exactly, but it was one of the times where, the Times used to have sort of the quote of the day, and it would be pulled out in the front of the paper. And this one woman wanted her perfume to smell like her horse. And I forget what the perfumer had this amazing quote, and I can't remember it. I should have looked it up, but that always stuck out as something that was out there. But in terms of a favorite column, there's probably one early on. It's been 12 years now, so people don't remember it as well as they did, when I first wrote it. But for good 5 or 6 years, people would always bring up this column about a dispute over a brick wall in Westport, Connecticut. The Westport Wall, and it was two people who weren't going to budge, pun intended, over the wall. And let's say the wall, it was expensive. Let's say the wall cost $200,000 to build. By the time I talked to them, they'd spent, 400, $500,000 litigating each other because one guy wanted the wall to come down. It wasn't his wall, obviously. And then the guy who had the wall said, I'm not taking my wall down. And they went back and forth. And what that was, it showed like how out of control anybody can get when emotion and money mix. And I got so many letters from people who hadn't spent the magnitude of money, but they had had squabbles at their HOA association over something. And to a person, they all regretted it. They all regretted the time, the emotional energy, and the money they spent, arguing over something that probably could have been settled in a less, time, in a more efficient way.
So with emotions, I guess one topic is kids and money. And I saw you wrote a column back in 2019 about this topic. You've probably written lots of columns about it, but you sort of quipped in there that people will talk to their kids about drugs and drinking and driving. And yet when it comes to talking to kids about money, there's this aversion. Why is that the case, do you think? And why is it so important? And when you talk to advisors about talking to their clients or counseling their clients about talking about money, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the first part of that question, it's the aversion is always because parents are afraid that if their kids know how much money they have or may one day inherit, it's going to rob them of any incentive to do well in life. This is sort of patently false because parents somehow think that they exist in this bubble where they're the only source of information for their children about the family's wealth. I mean, if you're stupendously wealthy, you can look it up. If you live in a 10,000 square foot house and all your friends live in a 2,000 square foot house, you figured it out that your parents have some money. There's this nifty little tool called Zillow, which will tell you exactly how much your parents' house costs. We can all figure out how much a car costs. And so, in trying to sort of shield their children from that information, they're just allowing them to go and figure it out on their own. In the same way that no parent wants to, not talk about drugs because they fear that their kid will go figure it out on their own. They don't want to talk about sex because they're always going to talk about sex because they don't want them to, figure it out from their friends. And when it comes to advisors, it's tough because advisors, I think, a lot that I've talked to, they know that this is a problem, but they tread lightly because it's the client's money, and the client, doesn't have to heed their advice. But imagine for a moment if you went to the doctor and the doctor said you have type 2 diabetes, or the doctor said you have cancer. you couldn't see it. You can't see it from the outside, just as you can try to hide stuff around your wealth, but you wouldn't say, I have type 2 diabetes. I look fine. I shaved today. Nothing happened. I look the same. You would take action. You would be scared and you do whatever you need to do. It's the same thing with people who think that they can, you know, downplay the vestiges of their wealth and then never talk to their children about it. I mean, one of the worst examples I ever wrote about was a fella who, after I think it was after 2008, probably, he told his kids that he'd lost all the money. It was all gone. They'd never get anything, and he still had tens of millions of dollars. And what that's going to do is create resentment because your children are going to make different choices in their life um, that they wouldn't have, otherwise. And you see it play out time and time again, like hiding it, the amount of money you have from your children. The children are never happy with it in the end, and it never creates, family harmony. Like everything in life, it's better to be upfront and honest about it.
So, in your reporting, did you find some strategies that are particularly effective for helping people talk about money?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best is it's a classic sort of, group scenario where the advisor, works with, the patriarch, the matriarch, the husband and wife, the spouse, whatever it is, and gets them to talk openly about what their fears are. Because it's not money. It's not like money is just a means of exchange. If you have more money, you can buy more things. If you have less money, you can't buy as many things. That's all it is. I mean, I've written about it in one of my books. You can only do four things with money. You can save it, you can spend it, you can give it away, and you can think about it. And that's it. You can't do anything else with money. And so the savviest advisors will get their clients to say, what is your real fear? Your real fear isn't that you're going to give your child fill in the blank, $500,000, $5 million, $50 million, whatever. Your real fear is something else. And then on the flip side, that savvy advisor is going to be able to get permission to convene the client, to convene their children, and get the children to say, what do you think mom and dad have? What do you think they want to do? What do you want? Because you and I, as sort of trained reporters, you learn an awful lot by asking people questions and listening to their answers. It's that simple. And you often make mistakes when you try to imagine what somebody else is thinking or feeling. It's much better to say, what do you want out of this? And for a while, there's a fellow, Joe Duran, who I've interviewed many times over the years. He had a firm called United Capital, which about a year ago was bought by Goldman Sachs. But he came up with this idea early on called honest conversations, and it was essentially a card game where the husband and wife, the couple, whatever it was, they would sit down and they would answer these questions, and then it was like a game of poker. You have your five cards, and then you reveal. And what you would do is you would see where you matched up. You would see, okay, we have two cards in common, three cards in common, and then you talk about whatever number of cards weren't in common as your way to sort of get to the discussion. Little tricks like that go a long way of getting people to relax and open up.
So I was doing some research ahead of the podcast and I came across some of your work on money scripts. And actually, I hadn't heard that term before. And it seems like it's a really critical area for us all to think about. And I think it was one of your columns you wrote about, you said they help us understand the hardwired, deep-seated beliefs we have about money. So what exactly are money scripts and how should advisors be using them?
Yeah. Money scripts is something that came up in research by my second favorite bald person, Dr. Brad Klontz. And Dr. Brad Klontz is a financial psychologist. And he was in Hawaii for a while. He lives in Boulder. He teaches at Creighton University. And this is research that he came up with. And he and I worked together on some academic research. He's also in one of my books. But the money scripts, it is just that. It's the hard wiring. It's, what did we learn when we were young about what it means, to have money? For some people, your net worth is your self-worth. I mean, that's a hardwired, money script. For other people, they have a sense of aversion, or they believe that, only people only get money by doing nefarious things. Money only goes to people who've lied and cheated. Other people feel entitled about money. I mean, one of the great examples that Brad Klontz came up with is if you take the same scenario and play it out with three different outcomes, how that will ingrain and change somebody's money script. So, for example, a family of four, two parents, two kids, they're living in a house and they're about to lose the house. Okay, that's the same for all three scenarios. In scenario one, they lose the house. In scenario two, the grandparents come in and bail them out. And in scenario three, the parents work really hard and find a way to save the house on their own. Okay. Same initial scenario, three very different outcomes. And even the two outcomes in which they hold on to the house are wildly different. In one, sort of force majeure, something comes in and saves you. In another, kind of top down, another sort of bottom up, you figured out a way to work. Nobody forgets that. I mean, this is, kids don't forget that, parents don't forget that, and that becomes, part of the sort of family history. And those manuscripts, to really understand them, are crucial to understand why somebody, makes the same bad decisions again and again. Or, on the flip side, why somebody saves way more money than she's ever going to need in her lifetime.
So you've written about everything from manuscripts to neighbors feuding over walls to horse-smelling perfumes, 575 columns. I mean, don't you, or do you run out of ideas? I mean, I don't know how you keep finding ideas. How do you, what's your process for writing your columns?
Great. Thank you. You've just jinxed me. That's it. I'm not going to, 576. I'm going to be staring at my screen later today. Has changed a lot, particularly, during the pandemic, but there's no magic formula. I mean, I was super disciplined, maniacally disciplined, as you know, and, the column is due on Wednesday. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is reporting and writing. And then up until 2020, every Thursday and Friday, I would just meet people. I would talk to them on the phone if they didn't live around here. I'd go into the city, and I'd have 4 or 5 meetings in a day. I'd meet somebody for breakfast. I'd meet somebody for lunch. I'd have a cup of coffee. I'd meet somebody for a drink before I went home. And it was that kind of just shoe leather nature of it. That was a good part of it. Another part of it was obviously there are public relations people, and then they'll come to you and they'll say I have an idea for a client. And look, they've been very helpful over the years. It doesn't always work out. Unfortunately, some of them pitch you after the story is run, or some of them pitch you with a sort of urgency that I may not share. But I have all these files, and oh yeah, I remember XYZ from 123 firm. They were doing something like this. Let me reach out and see if they're still doing this. That could be that one person could be the nugget for a broader column in which I'll talk to a dozen people. And then, also, I don't want to play this down. I get a lot of emails. From readers who, and it's the classic, this isn't me who does this, but I have a friend who's done something similar to this. And I got one the other day, which was remarkable. It was somebody essentially saying, one of my best friends, I believe, has swindled the government. And I was like, okay. I was like, please tell me. And I haven't heard back from that person ever since. But that sort of, took the cake of somebody willing to tell me something that was pretty remarkable. Oftentimes it's more, but my grandma is having a problem with this. We set up this sort of plan, and XYZ happened. Have you ever heard of it before? And sometimes I have, sometimes I haven't. But it often serves as that. You need that kernel, that initial kernel, to sort of start the column popping along.
So people love hearing about flops and mistakes. I suppose there's a little bit of Schadenfreude in thinking, well, they made those mistakes, I won't make them. But are there any sort of mistakes you've heard about or you've written about that are obvious mistakes that people should be avoiding? I guess more in the sort of behavioral finance realm of thinking.
Oh, man. I thought you were going to ask me my own mistakes. I was happy to tell you about that, too. But yeah, I mean, what are the common mistakes? I mean, people, unfortunately, things repeat. I mean, in behavioral finance, it's that anchoring bias. I mean, that's the bias that's probably, the strongest. This thing worked before, so it'll probably work again. Why? Or the flip side, this thing didn't work the last time. It probably won't work again. Or the craziest one is, this thing failed. I'm going to keep doing the same exact thing, and it's going to keep failing. I mean, that's sort of the definition of insanity. But it's all of those things that once you present it to somebody, once you get people to not think of the sort of 1980s, 1990s version of personal finance, which is what was my stock and bond portfolio doing? Once you get people away from that and get them thinking, more conceptually. I mean, Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for many different things, but one of the simplest yet most important things he did was create the idea of mental accounting. That we have these sort of buckets in our head where everything goes, and once you can get somebody thinking in that capacity, that they have enough in their bucket for the next 6 months, they have enough in their bucket for 2 years after that, and once they start thinking like that, they start to make much better decisions because they're not as reactive. They're not, because I guess I have to end it when I say they're not as reactive. I mean, that of course brings up, loss aversion. Everybody is quite happy now that stock market indices are charting in record territory. At least as we're talking now, I've probably jinxed it. It's probably going to go straight down. But if it were to go down, X number of points, certain people panic. And it's getting more and more absurd because the Dow is so high, at least at the moment of us talking. When you hear on the news, like, the Dow fell 593 points today, you're like, well, who cares? It's over 30,000. It doesn't matter, but people hear that number, and that's the loss aversion kicking in. So again, once you can get people thinking more conceptually in those buckets, they realize that 593 points is just a blip and insignificant.
So you mentioned Richard Thaler. He was actually one of our speakers at our annual conference a few years ago. If I'm not mistaken, you actually have met Richard Thaler. Is that right? And was that for your book, The Thin Green Line?
Yeah, I did. And I joke about it, like talk about my own ingrained behavioral biases. I met him in his house in San Diego, in a really nice neighborhood of San Diego. But when I was driving up there, all the houses on one side were pretty modest, and I was like, huh. This guy's, pretty famous guy, done pretty well. And all the houses on the other side were beautiful. And I was like, oh, where does he live? And I pull up and he was on, the side of the street where all the houses were beautiful. And so I was like, I wonder why he wants to live in this neighborhood with all these crummy houses. And he opens his door and there was a clear shot at the Pacific Ocean. You're like, oh, this is why all these houses are so beautiful. But he was great. And I talked to him many times over the years. I haven't talked to him recently. But he was a savvy guy, and talk about somebody who knew how to do his own mental accounting. He's a real, as he said, he calls himself a wino. I mean, he loves wine, he collects wine, he shares wine. And I sat down, and as I'm one of the great freeloaders of all time when it comes to great wine. And he sits down and he offers me a glass, one glass, and that was it. And I finished it, and I was kind of like looking at it, like, is there any more here? And that was it, one and done. We did my interview, and he sent me on his way.
So tell the audience, what is the Thin Green Line and what were you trying to do with that book?
The Thin Green Line is the difference between being, wealthy and rich, which a lot of people hear that and think that's semantics or those are synonyms. But if, the CFA audience will get it instantly. If you think of chart the S&P since the 1980s, it goes up. It's a lot higher today than it was in the 1980s, but it's not a straight line. It's jagged, there's dips. If you paint that line green and put that in your mind, that's what I want people to have as an image. And there are people on, the top of that line who I consider wealthy. Now it's not just, the CEOs, John Huntsman seniors of the world who I talked to in that book. It's also, lower down on that line. It's, teachers, nurses, small town attorneys who don't have the earning capacity of some CEOs, of some entrepreneurs, but have made crucial decisions so that they can, own their own time. They can, life is not going to make decisions for them. They're going to make their own decisions. I consider them wealthy. On the other side of that line are people who are rich and poor. Obviously, if you're on the bottom of that line at the very start, you're trying to get by. You're trying to make money. You're not worried about saving. You're worried about just paying your bills. But as you go up that line, there are people making, tens of millions of dollars who I consider rich. Why are they rich? They're overly leveraged. They're making foolish decisions. They're trying to keep up with the Joneses. They're, spending money today that they're not going to earn until tomorrow. At any point, that can fail. And suddenly, they're not going to be making decisions anymore. Decisions are going to be made for them. And that, to me, is really, who gets to make the decisions. That's the difference between being wealthy and rich.
So The Thin Green Line was your second book. Actually, your first book was Clutch. Now, I have this memory. I'm not sure if I have it quite correct, but November 27th, 2009, that was the day that Tiger Woods crashed his car. And if I'm remembering correctly, you had just submitted your manuscript to the publisher, or you were about to submit your manuscript. And Tiger Woods at that time featured quite prominently in the book. Just refresh my memory and tell the audience what happened there.
Yeah. Well, what happened with Tiger is he crashed his car, and we all know, sort of what happened afterwards. It was revealed that he was having multiple affairs on his wife. His wife, understandably, was not very happy with him, and his whole life changed. But I had interviewed Tiger more than a year before, after he'd won his last U.S. Open at Torrey Pines, and it's his one of his most famous victories. His knee is shot. He's hobbling around, and somehow he wins. And I thought, like, the key interview for me to write a book called Clutch, which is all about people who do well under pressure, people in business, people in law, actors who are giving soliloquies, and of course, sports figures, was to talk to Tiger, who's the most clutch athlete of his generation. And I met him. I flew down to South Carolina. We talked. And he gave me a couple things here and there. It wasn't the best interview I've ever had, but I got enough to be able to have Tiger in the book. And then you're right. I submit the book, and I can't believe it. Like, I remember it to this day. I'm putting up the Christmas tree in my house, right after Thanksgiving, and this will date, put it back in time. I have a BlackBerry, a thing called a BlackBerry, and I can see what's going on here. Um, Goodness, what's happened? Is he dead? Did this happen? And in the intervening weeks, I realized that although what happened to him was horrible, a tragedy, it kind of it helped me prove the broader point of the book, because as we watched what happened to Tiger after that, he was a disaster under pressure. He had people who had shielded him his whole life. He had people who gave him bad advice and continued to give bad advice. He didn't accept responsibility for what he did. He gave this press conference with his mom in the office that was cringeworthy. But it proves the broader point that being great under pressure isn't something that's innate. It's not something everybody can do. You have to work at it. And Tiger was amazing under pressure when he was on the golf course. But when it came to the rest of his life, he was probably worse than you and me. I mean, he made a bad decision, and then he just compounded it again and again and again. And under the pressure of being in the spotlight, it just deteriorated. And it showed that, again, being clutch is something you have to learn, and it's not something that instantly translates across every aspect of your life.
So for as long as I've known you, you have been crazy about golf. I mean, I can remember back at the FT, if I needed a golf analogy, I had to go to you to find out, like, what I say about golf. And now I believe you're writing a monthly column for Golf Magazine.
Right. But also, like, if the readers can see here, this is my home office. There's a putting green there. There's a couple flags hanging up behind me. There's golf clubs in the back. It is what you say, Lauren, is completely true, and there's the proof behind me to prove it. But yes, I am writing a monthly column for golf called Money Game, sort of the intersection of money and golf, and it came about in the most serendipitous way. For the 12 years I've been with the Times, the 12 years I've been writing the Wealth Matters column, I've begged and begged and begged and begged to let me write about golf. And the running joke is I've achieved my lifelong dream at the Times, and I'm the seventh string golf writer for the New York Times. Like, after they go through six other people, they'll come to me. And in 2019, I was out at Pebble Beach. The U.S. Open was there, and it was the USGA media day. And I get to play with one of the guys from the USGA. A couple of the guys are following us around. The guy I'm profiling is with me, and they have this other fella join us. And I say, sure, come on board. And he's trying to break 90 from the back tees at Pebble Beach. So for anybody who doesn't know golf, he's just trying to shoot a pretty mediocre score, but at a U.S. Open course. And poor guy, he's struggling because he didn't read clutch, and the pressure's getting to him. But he's being filmed while he's doing this, and all his buddies are chasing him around. And I notice on the third hole that this pregnant woman is following him. And so I go up and I introduce myself to him, and I say, look, I've got 3 kids. It's your first, yes. I noticed that these guys, these kind of jokers, keep taking your golf cart. Do you want me to say something to them?" And she says, "Oh no, don't worry. I like to walk." And I said, "Okay." And all of these people work for me. So if I want the golf cart, they'll give it back to me. And I say, "Oh, what do you do?" And she is the editorial director of Golf Magazine. And so the conversation started on the third hole at Pebble Beach, and by the 14th hole, she said, "I know your column at the Times. Would you ever want to write a golf column for us?" And I said, "Sign me up. Sign me. I don't even know what it is." And so it's been a really fun 18 months of kind of really like getting to talk to some of my childhood heroes and getting to nerd out on golf. And my wife has been so grateful because now I don't have to nerd out on golf around her. I can go to real golf nerds. So it's been great for my marriage as well.
So, who is your favorite golfing character and what's your favorite golfing story?
Oh, my favorite. Well, right now, I'd say my favorite golfing character is Harry Higgs. And Harry is new on the PGA Tour, but he wears Wayfarers. He perhaps had one too many cheeseburgers. He leaves his, shirts unbuttoned, but he's a great player. And I got to interview him a couple months ago, and he was, just the same kind of, wildly talented but good natured guy you could see on TV. And obviously we like to think he's an inspiration to all of us, dads who perhaps packed on the pounds in COVID, but he's a wildly talented player. My favorite golf story is probably from back at the FT. When I was at the FT, Greg Norman, the great Australian golfer, I think he just started his wine. I mean, this is 20 years ago, or maybe he was just promoting it, whatever it was. But he wanted to meet with somebody at the FT to discuss his wine, and I know nothing about wine. I mean, I like wine, I drink wine, but I'm no wine expert. But I put my hand up and I said, I love Greg Norman. I want to go. And we sit in this office and he's there, and I am so nervous. Like, this was my childhood hero. Like, I would pretend to be Greg Norman in the backyard of my house. And he starts off, and I won't do his accent, but he says, "Paul, essentially, I don't want to suck up to you, but the FT is my favorite paper. I really wanted to meet with somebody from the FT. I thought you guys could really write about my wine, and this means an awful lot to me to actually be sitting down with a reporter from the FT." And I said, "Greg, let's be on equal footing here. You're my childhood hero. I used to pretend I was Greg Norman in my backyard. So if you admit that to me, I admit that to you. Let's go from there." And Greg and I had a great talk. And I remember that. I mean, again, 20 years ago, and I still can see Greg Norman sitting across from me, and it was just a real thrill.
That is great. So this is where we come to the end of the show, where I do the lightning round of closing questions.
Oh boy!
And
all right,
then the same questions.
Sip of water here.
Yes. So the same questions to all the guests. It started out with one question, then it became 2 questions, and now it's morphed into 3. So first question, the ray of sunshine question, and that's, what's one positive long-term outcome that you hope you'll see as a result of the pandemic?
I would say simply, one of the things that this is a personal answer, but I hope other people have the same experience. Just spending so much more time with my kids and having so much more, fun. I've got 3 daughters, as you know, and I really made a point of finding an activity that they like and doing it with just them alone. And we just go and do it once or twice a week. And I hope that continues when I'm back, commuting into the city, because it's been a real joy. And I hope other people have had that same experience with their children.
Question number 2, it's called the NASA question. And that is, you're about to get on a long duration space flight and you can take with you one object. I might be able to guess what it might be, but what is the one object you will take with you?
Wait, where does the long duration space flight? What is the one object I take with me? Oh boy, that's a good question. And you think you can guess it? Boy, I don't know. I think one of my kids would give me one of their teddy bears. So I probably would be sitting in the long duration flight, clutching, probably my daughter's, Nemo stuffed animal. That's what I see happening. But yeah, I got to turn. What did you think I was going to say?
I would have thought you'd taken your golf, putting green.
Or
a Kindle.
Can I play golf on Mars? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if you can, right? Maybe the ball will float in the air. Or
Exactly.
So that brings us to our final question, and it's what I call the flight versus invisibility question. And whichever you pick, You'll be the only person in the world to have that superpower. Which do you pick and what do you do with it?
The ability to fly or the ability to be invisible?
Yep.
Oh, that's easy. I would 100% pick the ability to fly. And I'm supposed to say something noble that I'm sure, but I would use it to skip all the lines. I'd never wait in line again. You just imagine me with my stuffed Nemo, flying off somewhere. It would be wonderful.
Well, excellent. It's been so much fun chatting with you, Paul. Good luck with column number 576.
Thanks, Lauren. It's great fun.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you're listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and it helps others find the show. Also, a quick reminder, this podcast isn't intended to provide expert advice on the topics we covered. If you need tax, accounting, or legal advice, please consult a professional. I'm Lauren Foster. Thanks so much for listening.